completely evidence-based. Somebody ideologically saying we should do this, we should do that, and then it doesn't actually stack up from a funding perspective.
But do you think it has a shelf life? I mean, do you think it is?
So I think that the licence fee on its own will be problematic if we are to make sure that the BBC continues to be the fantastic provider and public sector broadcaster that it is. So I think, yes, that we do need to look at this agenda. Obviously, we aren't renewing and a great deal of work has been done on this agenda now, and I know, having spoken to the senior team, that it's something that they're particularly passionate about themselves as well.
Ensuring impartiality.
Yes.
Tim Davey, the Director General, has made it one of his main focuses.
However, I would also say there is a difference between having a plan and delivering that change. And it is certainly not job done by any stretch of the imagination. And we only have to look at a plethora of different examples that have come up to highlight the fact that there is still a problem.
What example?
Well, if we look at the incident of the bus with the alleged anti-Semitism, if we look at the incidences of certain commentators and reporters, look at the comments that Gary Lineker and others have made, that is indicative of a culture that still has an issue around impartiality. And that's why it's something that I will be particularly looking at and focusing on. I'm working with the BBC on this agenda, but we've been conducting the midterm review, which will have a particular focus around impartiality. I think it's so important. I think it's also important to the long-term viability of the BBC. Because if you think about it, in today's age, we've got so much fake news out there that people deserve, but also expect and need to be able to know that their PSBs are really trusted sources of information. So it's in everybody's interest that we get this right and that we address the issue head on. So we're looking at this as part of the midterm review.
Okay. I mean, I would really like to talk to you about the story that's dominated the headlines for the past few weeks. Prince Harry. I mean, in his Netflix documentary, he described the hounding of him and his wife, Meghan, by what he believes is a racist and misogynist press. His book has followed. Will you be buying a copy?
I might not buy a copy of his book. I think I won't really have any time to read his book amongst everything else. It's not on my sort of priority list, shall we say. But I know it is for many other people.
You know, soon after the programme aired, Jeremy Clarkson wrote in The Sun of his hatred of Meghan, comparing her with the serial killer Rose West. He talked about wanting her to see her paraded naked through the streets and all of that. You know, it became the most complained about column in the history of the press regulator. What was your reaction to that?
Well, I believe in freedom of speech very, very strongly. Obviously, we all have to be mindful of what we say and the ramifications of that, but I am a believer of freedom of speech.
So you think he should have been able to write that?
I think that he had the right to say what he wanted to say, but obviously it was going to get the reaction that it got, and it was going to concern a number of people. So I wouldn't have said what he said, you know, and I don't align myself with the comments that he made. Categorically, no. Of course,
because he does say, Prince Harry says, proves his point. It proves his point. The press is misogynist, racist.
Well, no. We do have to have a freedom of press. We do have to have people to be able to a position where people can air opinions that we don't all agree with. That is the nature of our media sector and press, and it's important for democracy. It's important for exposing things. It's important for challenging democracy, holding politicians to account. You know, I read the papers every day. I see many stories that I don't agree with, or the perspective that I don't agree with, and that's quite right. And I would always champion journalist freedom and their ability and right to be able to write that content. It doesn't mean I agree with all of that, but that's the nature of free speech. Of course, that shouldn't stray into illegal content or go in certain directions, but yeah, I defend his right to be able to say what he wants.
Prince Harry, obviously, he says the media killed his mother, hounded his wife. Do you think that there needs to be more press regulation? Clearly, from what you're saying, I don't think you do.
Well, since obviously the tragic events of what happened to Diana and also other incidences, we have regulated the press more than was the case back then. But of course, there's a balance to get here, isn't there? Because of the importance role that the press play in our democratic system, and providing people with a voice and challenging the status quo and exposing things. All of that couldn't happen if you stifle the media to the point that you're limiting what people are saying. So it's all about a balance, but we have regulated. I mean, we have self-regulation of the press. We've also, since passed Leveson, etc. So there are many different things that we've done since some of the incidences that you're referring to.
And when it comes to regulation, let's talk about government's online safety bill. You know, you've been talking about protecting people, particularly children, online for 3 years. We've gone through 4 prime ministers. It's still not law. Why is it so hard?
Well, we are the first country in the world to do this. It is no simple act at all, really, when you think about the fact that we are regulating social media for the first time. In fact, a lot of countries are looking at what we're doing so that they can then implement that blueprint themselves. I've got it back on the agenda. We now are passing it through Parliament. It comes back next week, in fact, and then it will go to the House of Lords. It will become a law this parliamentary session, and the Prime Minister has committed to that himself as well. So we are on the track to deliver this,
Although
and to
you have been
deliver
accused of
a
watering
stronger.
it down.
Well, no, actually, it's a stronger bill.
So why do people like Molly Russell's father, you know, the awful story of her taking her own life after viewing harmful content online, and more recently Nadine Dorries, your predecessor, they both say you've watered it down, have you?
Well, I've spoken to and worked with Molly Russell's father and other campaigners who've done an incredible job at really pushing this agenda forward. What we have done is strengthen it in relation to children. We've added more protections in for children. That was something that I felt very strongly about when I came into the role. Fundamentally, if we get one thing right with this bill, it has to be protecting children. They're at the heart of this piece of legislation. That's why we've made it stronger. And then when it comes to adults, we've rebalanced it in terms of freedom of speech. And we've introduced this triple shield of protection. So first of all, if it's illegal content, it has to go. Secondly, if it's a breach of the platform's own terms and conditions, and we know that they all have the things that you would expect them to have, like anti-Semitism, racism, all of those things, then it has to go. So they're having to live up to what they're promising people, which they're not doing at the moment. And then there's a third safety net. So if there's stuff that's getting through that you're still uncomfortable with and it doesn't pass those first 2 barriers, you will then be empowered to be able to filter out some of that content and have other user empowerment tools at your fingertips. Now, that wasn't in the original bill, so I do believe this is a stronger bill. This is a bill that also at the same time protects freedom of speech, which I think is really important.
How often do you meet with the tech companies?
So I meet with all stakeholders as regularly as I possibly can. I met with them a number of times before we got this bill back into the Commons, so very regularly. But also I meet with supporters of different causes. I meet with particularly the bereaved parents, to hear everybody. I'm an evidence-based politician. When I came into the role, I wanted to make the changes in the correct way that produce a stronger, better piece of legislation.
I just wonder whether you worry that these tech companies are too powerful. You know, if you take a step back, is it odd that these foreign companies have such an influence in Britain and across the world?
Well, look, if you look at the ramifications of breaching this piece of legislation, they're massive. We're talking of humongous fines that will cripple an organisation, especially if they were repeatedly fined these volumes. So it will change behaviour, and it will mean that we're in the driving seat. For too long, they've been not protecting children, not living up to their roles and responsibilities. They've been allowing content that is deeply damaging, especially for minors to see. And as a government, we're putting a stop to that.
Okay, and you are Culture Secretary, and a huge talking point right now is around restitution, and particularly about the Parthenon sculptures, and many people know them as the Elgin marbles. What is your view on whether they should return to Greece?
Oh, I've been very clear on this, that I don't think that they should return to Greece. I can completely understand why some people believe that they should be returned, and I can sympathise with their view on it, but I think that opens a complete can of worms. It would be a slippery slope. You would end up with so many amazing artefacts under question of whether they should go back to another country, and it's very dubious over the ownership at certain stages of things. And let's not forget, you know, these are assets of our country that we've cared for, that we've looked after, that we have allowed the world to see in the British Museum, not just British people, but the world, to have access to them. I think sending them back is a dangerous road to go down, but also one that is prohibited in law. We're not about to change the law to facilitate that. It's important that we stand up and protect our culture and enable everybody around the globe to see that here.
Even for things that have been looted. I'm not saying they were looted,
No, they
but
weren't, certainly.
Even for objects, the Benin bronzes or other items that were looted.
Well, I think it is important that we don't confuse this with other incidences. These weren't looted, as you pointed out, and the law already prohibits the restitution, the sending them back to Greece, and I think the law is in the right place.
Has George Osborne, former Chancellor, now Chairman of the British Museum, has he approached you about this?
I've had several conversations with George Osborne. I think his view on this has been misinterpreted and certainly portrayed wrongly. And
in what way?
Well, he's not about to send them back, basically. That's not his intention. He has no desire to do that. And there's also been this concept of a 100-year loan mooted as well, which is certainly not what he's planning either. So I think it's important that you can obviously speak to him. He can speak very well for himself without me having to do it for him. But he would agree with me that we shouldn't be sending them back. And actually, they do belong here in the UK, where we've cared for them for a great deal of time, where we've allowed access to them, and along with other artifacts around the nation. And this would open the gateway to the question of our entire contents of our museums. I mean, this is a very slippery slope to go down. I think it's important that we stand up and protect them.
And as we come to the end, I'd also like to ask you about Eurovision,
Yes,
which was
very
originally
exciting.
supposed to be held this year in Ukraine after they won the competition, but it's going to be in Liverpool in May. The city's local government will be paying around £4 million. It's rumoured to be costing the BBC just under £10 million. Are there any plans for national government to be contributing?
Yes, we are. We are contributing as well. This is really important that we get this right, especially for our partners in the Ukraine, who obviously would have loved the opportunity to host this. And it's very sad that they can't do. And I want to make sure it is a true celebration of their culture, their music, their identity, and it is very much their Eurovision that we are hosting, as opposed to the other way around.
How much taxpayers' money will go into it from central government?
Well, that will all be detailed and we'll be very transparent with the exact sums. But it is important that we get this right. And these things
Millions?
these things also generate more money in the long run anyway. If you look at the amount of hotel rooms that will be filled, the investment in the local economy, the legacy impact, it's a bit like Commonwealth Games and other national celebrations and sporting events that we host. It will generate income as well as that expenditure.
You made history as the shortest serving cabinet minister in British history as Secretary of State for Education. People have talked about this revolving door when it comes to the role of Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, that people don't stay in the job very long. Just at the end, I wanted to ask you, do you plan to stay in this for a while?
I certainly do, yes. I was in the cabinet for almost a year before I took that role in education as well.
And then less than 36 hours in that role.
Indeed, but I certainly intend to be here for a while. We've got a great deal of work to get through, some of which we've spoken about today, but there is much, much more in my in tray and more that I want in my outbox.
Why do you think it is that has been this revolving door? Is it not seen as an important role?
Oh, it's seen as a vital role. When you think about it, we're the department that are the Department of Future Jobs. We're the beating heart of the economy. We are the department that affects people's lives every day, day in, day out. So it is important, absolutely. When you from your broadband to what you're watching on TV, Eurovision, as we just discussed, to issues like online safety for children in particular, gambling, all of these issues, they're really important to people because they are affecting their lives day in, day out. So it is an important role. I would argue the most important role in government because of that direct link with people's lives, not just now and again, but every single day.
Well, that was Michelle Donnellan, Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. And she made reference to how the BBC had reported an anti-Semitic attack on a group of Jewish students in 2021. Let me just add to that what the BBC have said about the reporting of that incident, which was in part based on a video of the incident filmed from inside the bus. The BBC said, while Ofcom has found that our reporting was not in breach of the broadcasting code, the BBC's Executive Complaints Unit ruled in January 2022 that more could have been done sooner to acknowledge the differing views about what could be heard on the recording of the attack. The BBC apologised at the time for not acting sooner to highlight that the contents of the recording were contested. And the Secretary of State also referenced Jeremy Clarkson's column about Meghan Markle. Clarkson later said he was horrified to have caused so much hurt. And the article was taken off the Sun website, and they said they regretted publishing it and were sincerely sorry. Well, with me, listening to that interview, is Lara O'Reilly. She's a senior correspondent on Insider's business desk covering tech and media. And I wondered, Lara, first, what's your reaction to that interview? And she certainly had a very broad brief.
Yeah, it's a big remit, and like you say, there's been so many people in the role. It's kind of, it'd be a fantastic pub quiz question to name the last 5. The highlights for me, I think, were her comments around press freedom. I did think her reaction was a little bit blasé, considering just exactly what you said. It was the most complained about article ever to IPSO, the press regulator. Not just that, but 60 cross-party MPs complained about it and asked the Sun to take it down, and it was eventually taken down. And I think it's very right to champion the Jeremy's right to say that. I think what I would have been interested in hearing more about was what is the kind of press that she wants, just considering the harm and offence that caused. So that was very interesting, but I'm sure people on Fleet Street will be kind of cheering at their desks at that reaction.
Well, we talked in that interview about the publication of Prince Harry's book Spare, which came out earlier this week, and I want to focus now on a high-profile media figure to come in for criticism from Prince Harry, who is Rebecca Brooks. She's the chief executive of Rupert Murdoch's News UK, and Harry doesn't hold back. Listen to this from the audiobook.
Who the hell is this editor? Loathsome toad, I gathered. Everyone who knew her was in full agreement that she was an infected pustule on the arse of humanity, plus a shit excuse for a journalist.
That is Prince Harry reading the audiobook of his autobiography Spare. He says Rebecca Brooks made up a story about him going to rehab. Lara, what do you think about what he said?
Spicy, isn't it? I mean, he should be a writer. It was really interesting.
Did he write it though? He had a ghostwriter.
Well, let's see. Well, he's kind of giving back what he's received over the years, I guess. It's interesting because Rebecca Brooks, so she's the head of News UK, which looks after the Sun and the Times and various other titles in the UK. Rebecca's worked for the News of the World and the Sun in the past as editor, and she's essentially been a shadow in his life, kind of throughout him growing up. It's been the spectre that's followed him around everywhere, and he has to, give back sometimes what he's been given.
In what sense? What do you mean by that?
Well, so he argues in his book that that Prince Charles and Camilla's office kind of colluded with the Sun to put bad stories about him in the press, and and not just bad but also incorrect stories, and he feels as though he wasn't really given a kind of right reply.
We of course did approach the Sun and News UK about all this, and they chose not to comment, but one American website reported earlier this week that Rebecca Brooks will be taking on the top job in the Murdoch media empire, in charge of both News Corp and Fox Corp companies, once the deal to merge them is complete. And we should say that the reports have definitely not been substantiated. But would that be a surprising appointment? I mean, does it seem likely to you?
I'm not so sure, just given, well, there's a couple of things. One, nobody else has followed up that report and confirmed it. Two, the plot line of succession would dictate that it would probably be a Murdoch that would run those two companies. That said, it would be a very interesting appointment. Rebecca's stayed very loyal to Rupert Murdoch throughout the years, and he's rewarded her handsomely. So were she to get the top job, perhaps that wouldn't be so much of a surprise. He certainly looked after her through the phone hacking scandal.
Okay, and the Sun faced fresh accusations in October of last year that phone hacking took place at the newspaper, something they've always denied, and including when Rebecca Brooks was editor. What's your sense of that?
So that would be significant, because what News UK has said in the past was that phone hacking was restricted just simply to News of the World, and it didn't happen at the Sun. And although there's been allegations against the Sun, they've been settled out of court essentially, and News Corp hasn't accepted any liability for that. So were this to kind of spread this toxicity, and especially just given the high profile role that Rebecca Brooks has now, this just opens the envelope, it opens the can of worms once again, and this is the scandal that just doesn't go away. This is 10 years old now.
Have you got any details, any sense of how it might play out in terms of when we might hear more?
I don't know that. I mean, these things can sometimes take a while. There's also a bunch of things happening with some old News of the World cases too. These fresh allegations came out in October. Perhaps we might see something this year.
Well, we will keep watching, and a reminder that Prince Harry also has a case out against another group of newspapers associated, so we'll watch it all with interest, but I'm afraid that is all we've got time for. Thank you so much to my guests, Michelle Donnellan, Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, and to Laura O'Reilly here in the studio from Insider. And thank you all so much for listening to The Media Show. We'll be back next week. But until then, have a good day. Goodbye.
The Media Show was presented by Katie Razzle. The producer was Helen Fitzhenry. The studio engineers were Donald McDonald and Duncan Hannant.
I'm Claudia Hammond, and I'd love to know if there's someone who's made a real difference to your mental health. If so, there's still time to enter the All in the Mind Awards 2023. Maybe there's a friend or a boss who's changed everything for you, or a professional like a therapist or doctor or nurse, or maybe you attended some kind of mental health project. I'd love to hear your story, and I'm sure they'd love to know the difference they made. To enter, go to the All in the Mind page of the Radio 4 website. The terms and conditions and the privacy notice are there too. You have until midnight on the 31st of January to enter. Can't wait to read what you have to say.
On FM, Longwave and BBC Sounds, this is Radio 4. It's 5 o'clock, time for PM with Evan Davis.
Hello. Iran is preparing to execute a British-Iranian dual citizen. He's been charged with spying for the UK. His death sentence confirmed this afternoon. The story has been developing just in the last 90 minutes. We'll bring you the latest and get reaction from the chair of the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. Also on PM this afternoon, you may have just heard this on Radio 4's media show about the Parthenon sculptures, or Elgin marbles.
Sending them back is a dangerous road to go down, but also one that is prohibited in law. We're not about to change the law to facilitate that. It's important that we stand up and protect our culture.
Well, does that, from Culture Secretary Michelle Donnellan, in one go put an end to the reported progress?
Individual or to threaten those, but also it's a chance for the Iranians to reiterate their narrative that the British government, the American governments are trying to undermine the regime and overthrow the Iranian regime.
The line isn't perfect, I'm afraid.
Route out here.
The French have got a very interesting new law, which is essentially around saying for eating in,
He told MPs on the Transport Select Committee that the mandate would be used in talks tomorrow with the TSSA and the RMT unions. In the past half hour,
Artifacts under question of whether they should go back to another country, and it's very dubious over the ownership. And let's not forget, these are assets of our country that we've cared for, that we've looked after, that we have allowed the world to see in the British Museum, not just British people, but the world, to have access to them. I think sending them back is a dangerous road to go down, but also one that is prohibited in law. We're not about to change the law to facilitate that. It's important that we stand up and protect our culture and enable everybody around the globe to see that. Yeah.
Even for things that have been looted. I'm not saying they were looted,
No, they weren't, certainly.
Even for objects that have been bronzes or other items that were looted.
Well, I think it is important that we don't confuse this with other incidences. These weren't looted, as you pointed out, and the law already prohibits the restitution, the sending them back to Greece, and I think the law is in the right place.
Has George Osborne, former Chancellor, now Chairman of the British Museum, has he approached you about this?
I've had several conversations with George Osborne. I think his view on this has been misinterpreted and certainly portrayed wrongly. And
in what way?
Well, he's not about to send them back, basically. That's not his intention. He has no desire to do that. There's also been this concept of a 100-year loan mooted as well, which is certainly not what he's planning either. So I think it's important that you can obviously speak to him. He can speak very well for himself without me having to do it for him. But he would agree with me that we shouldn't be sending them back, and actually they do belong here in the UK, where we've cared for them for a great deal of time, where we've allowed access to them, and along with other artifacts around the nation. And this would open the gateway to the question of our entire contents of our museums. I mean, this is a very slippery slope to go down. I think it's important that we stand up and protect them.
Well, that was Michelle Donnellan an hour ago on Radio 4. Now, the Greeks have tended not to like the idea of being lent something which they regard as Greek, as theirs. The Greek Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, today dismissed the idea that there was going to be an imminent repatriation of the Elgin marbles. But he's been speaking about this, and he does say there has been a significant change in the UK, and he says we'll continue to work towards the attainment of our goal I don't expect immediate results, but I believe we have already moved very systematically. Well, did Michelle Donnellan, in that interview with Katie Razzle, just put the kibosh on all this talk of some deal with Greece? What on earth do we make of that? Let's talk to Lord Vasey, Ed Vasey, Conservative peer, our second Conservative peer on the programme today, on the Lords Communications and Digital Committee. Ed Vasey was actually Culture Minister from 2010 to 2016. Ed, well, has Michelle Donnellan just killed it all off?
Well, first of all, I was very impressed by your simultaneous translation of Prime Minister Mitsotakis' remarks. Thank you.
Written down in
BBC presenters, no end to your talents. But no, I don't think it does put the kibosh on it. I mean, I don't want to speak for Michelle Donnellan, but what I took from what she said in her remarks with Katie Razzle, I'm not sure she was expecting to be talking about the Parthenon sculptures. I think she originally wanted to talk about her great triumph on Channel 4 privatisation. But I think she was saying the ownership should not be transferred back to Greece. Point number one, which has not been, certainly is not George Osborne's position. He doesn't want to transfer ownership either, rather. And also that they weren't going to go back to Greece on loan for 100 years, which again, George Osborne has never proposed that. As I understand it, George Osborne is open to the idea that the Parthenon sculptures could go back for a limited period of time, and Greece would send back some preeminent objects in return to be loaned to the British Museum. Now, obviously, on paper, that sounds like an eminently sensible solution, but as you've just indicated, there is public opinion on both sides that would find it unacceptable. The Greeks would find it unacceptable to be lent what they regard as their own, and some people, Michelle Donnellan articulated this point, would regard this as the thin end of the wedge.
Is it the Greek position, has it been the Greek position that if it's called a loan, they just don't take them? They would rather not have them in that museum next to the Parthenon if it's not theirs?
I think it's very, very difficult for the Greeks to allow that to happen. There's an election coming up in Greece, and already the Greek opposition leader has said that this situation is unacceptable. A museum in Sicily did effectively loan a sculpture, a small part of the Parthenon sculptures, and called it a deposit. They later did transfer ownership. But the key, I think, to this is to see whether we can get any opportunity for the Parthenon sculptures to physically return back to Athens, where they were for almost 2 millennia, without getting into the ownership question, and that's an extremely difficult hurdle to overcome.
So that is a hurdle, and it looks as though talks kind of continue on that. Interesting line from Michelle Donnellan that, I mean, she used this line: "We have to protect our culture." I mean, the Greeks probably would find that quite objectionable, I'm thinking, because it's obviously more their culture than our culture at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Michelle Donnellan was giving a legal deposition, so if she was, could be interpreted as being careless with her words. But I think the point she was making is twofold. One is that, you know, I think there should be some recognition in this negotiation that the Parthenon sculptures have been in the British Museum for 200 years, so they are part of the British Museum story. And if there is ever any movement on this in the right direction, in my view, they go back to Athens, that should be recognised. And secondly, she did come up with the argument, which a lot of people use, that this would begin a sort of a procession of people reclaiming objects, which I don't think would happen. And my message to Michelle Donnellan would be, you could set up a review committee. We have one at the moment that stops objects leaving the country if somebody buys them. We could have a perfectly sensible committee that would review any claims from foreign governments or foreign owners and give recommendations to the Secretary of State about whether that claim was in any way legitimate. But I certainly don't think there would be more than a handful of claims in any event.
Yeah, I mean, Katie Razzle drew the distinction between looted and other items. I'm wondering whether that's a very easy or cast iron distinction to make, whether there's something of a fuzzy boundary sometimes between looting and exploitative commercial trade and who the legitimate authority was to give you permission to take it at the time.
Exactly. It's a really difficult one. I mean, the Benin bronzes most from the British, and a lot of museums have now returned those objects, and indeed universities, and guess what, the sky hasn't fallen in. The US has as well, and we are in a climate now where people are being much more open to a debate about this and to potentially reopening, returning objects without